right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Let's Talk Coronavirus.
Here we are.
Yay! I am Rachel Bergstrom. I teach in the biology department at Beloit College, and we're here with our largest group of people for Let's Talk Coronavirus ever.
Nuts. Absolutely
we've got
nuts.
6 people and our intrepid social media manager, Whitney Helm. And so I will let everybody introduce themselves. What's your name? What's your interest? We're talking about history today, pandemics, historical pandemics. So Ron, take it away.
All right. So you all know me by now, Ron Watson. I am an associate professor here in political science and health and society. And I'll pass it on to my colleague in political science.
Hey, I'm Phil Chen. I'm here, assistant professor in political science. The late addition to the hosts, but the addition nonetheless for the summer. And so now let's pass it on to our guests. I think we're going to go in chronological order, correct?
Yes.
So I think that puts Liesl first.
So should we just introduce ourselves or also talk a little bit about the why?
Just introduction.
Just introduction. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm Liesl Walsh. I am an associate professor in the Greek, Latin, and Ancient Mediterranean Studies department, aka GLAM. Yeah.
You're muted, Ellen. We'll get it. There you are.
It's been at least 2 hours since I had my last Zoom meeting. I'm Ellen Joyce. I'm in the history department. I teach medieval history, among other things, and I'm here to talk about the Black Death.
Yay!
And I am Kate Johnston. I also teach in the history department, and I work mostly in the 18th century. And so today I'm also going to talk about yellow fever.
All right.
Awesome.
Well, welcome, folks. We're really excited to have you here. So just as a reminder for how we work things for our audience, we welcome questions on the Facebook comments. Send in your questions for our guests. We'll incorporate those into our discussion as we go. And this is also a part of a class right now. This is our second to the last week of class for new incoming first-year students at Beloit College. And so they have done some readings that were assigned by our guests, and they've given us some questions to drive our discussion. And as always, thank you to all of you students for your thoughtful questions. They are just really, really enriching our conversation. So Ron, do you want to get us started?
Yeah. So, and I want to go back, way back, right? To the ancient world to get our discussion started off. So Liesl, I mean, tell us a little bit about the perspective that you bring as our sort of classicist here, right? That you bring to this issue of epidemics, pandemics, and how it relates to COVID.
Yeah. So, I mean, I teach a class called Ancient Medicine fairly regularly for the Health and Society program. And so I do study ancient medical history as one of my sort of side gigs. And the thing that I find really fascinating about specifically ancient Greek medicine, so we're talking about like 500 or so BCE, is that they kind of don't know anything when they're aware that people get sick. They're aware that illnesses can move from one person to another, sort of, or from one household to another, or that illnesses will be centered in a town. But they don't have, they can't see diseases the way that we can see diseases. They are in the middle of they call it the Greek miracle, but of course it was something that they really inherited from the Egyptians and the ancient Near East. They're in the middle of this scientific and philosophic development where they're trying to just understand how the world works. And so their framing of health and illness is a part of this wider picture of how the whole world works. And so the way that they want to understand the human body is as a part of the natural world. And so for them, health is a matter of, they come up with this theory that I'm sure both Ellen and Kate are going to talk about, this theory of humors, which becomes very important, especially with like yellow fever, where there are these substances in the body, and they theorize it as blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. And if any one of those four substances is out of balance,
right.
that's why humans get sick. And so to the extent that like Ron and I could be in the same room as each other and we might catch the same illness, they would say, well, it's not because Ron and I it's not because there's a specific bug or something moving from one person to another. It's that there's something in the air in the room that is messing with our humors and throwing them off balance. And then seeking health or treating illness is a project of bringing those humors back into balance. And I mean, I always use ancient medicine as a way of questioning and critiquing contemporary medicine. And so for me, it's very similar to how we think about, you know, the levels of vitamins and minerals in our body.
Right.
Well,
yeah.
we might say like, oh, I'm low on B12 today. That's why I'm so tired and I feel like crap. Like I'm gonna eat some beef liver. It's gonna sort me right out.
Right.
So it's a very similar process to what the ancients were trying to figure out. Now, to get back to their ignorance, because they didn't really know about germs and communicability of diseases, and because they're in a project of trying to build knowledge so that they'll be able to predict what happens next and be able to treat people in the future, they kept a lot of, or at least one of the big sources that we have is this almost diary-like, it's like a doctor went around this one town.
Right.
Kind of, yeah, I was talking about this last time, and just kind of wrote down all these symptoms that people were experiencing. And it's like these little case studies.
Mm-hmm.
And it would just be like, okay, you know, next to the butcher's house, some guy drank too much wine and then he had a fever and that lasted for 3 days. And then he was like talking to himself. And his pee was a really weird color. Then on day 7, you know, his fever broke. But then on day 12, like he felt crappy again and was talking to himself again. And then on day 18, he died.
Right. Yeah.
And that's it, right? And so I'm finding that, and of course, students, they encounter this for the first time and they're like, this is completely whack. Like, how does this count as medical knowledge?
Yeah, but it's new, right? It's so completely new is the problem,
it's new,
right?
Yeah.
Process of observation.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Yes.
Pay attention.
Yes.
Right on.
And so, and you can almost imagine like using all of those case studies and trying to build like a little Excel spreadsheet of like, you know, fever and like the timings of these things and like trying to find the patterns, right? Which is kind of how we had to deal with COVID, right? Because we didn't know. I'm reading more about it, right? Like, I'm sure you guys have talked about it in class, like coronavirus research kind of only existed among veterinarians until 2003, right? Like, and there are so many coronaviruses out there that mostly don't infect humans. And so the people who are working on human diseases, they kind of didn't know anything about, they knew about like 5 coronaviruses and you know, they only picked up steam after SARS happened. And then all of a sudden they were like, oh crap, maybe we should pay attention to coronaviruses. So the extent, even to the extent that we understand coronaviruses as a category, as like a respiratory illness, is based on a really small sample size of coronaviruses. And so to the extent that people are, you know, experiencing strokes from COVID or getting the COVID toes or, you know, the clotting issues that people are finding with this particular coronavirus, it completely threw people for a loop, because that's not really how a respiratory illness manifests.
Right.
But all of the early accounts of people experiencing COVID were exactly like these ancient case studies of like, you know, I was asymptomatic, but I tested positive. And then like, you know, on day 3, I had a little bit of a cough and I had a fever. Day 5, I just felt really tired and achy.
Yeah.
You know, day 7, I had weird diarrhea, you know.
And what's really interesting about that too is that idea of defining a case, of observing the patients over time, it case definitions are an epidemiological thing, and it's a really important part of tracking the epidemics to know what you're looking for and to be able to say this person has it because they fit this category and this person doesn't. Granted, of course, the more we learn, there's shifts in these case definitions, and we've seen that with COVID too.
Yes.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. So I mean, when we think about the ancient world of it, it's funny, we were laughing about how they don't know anything, right? And then we find ourselves in this very modern version of not really knowing anything. So Ellen, let me move a few hundred years into the future, more than a few, more like nearly 1,000 years into the future, and talk to you about what your discipline and your disciplinary lens has to say about plagues, the Black Death. You promised us the Black Death, and how does that tie to COVID then?
So I'm not a historian of medicine. And so when I come to study the Black Death or the Great Plague, or as they called it at the time, the Great Mortality of about 1347 to around 1350, depending on where you were in Europe or in Asia, I tend to look at it more with an interest in some of the classic historians' questions. One are, what sources do we have about it? How do we know what we know about it? And that's why I shared this video about an Italian merchant's notebook, which I'll say more about in a second.
And I'll post that to Facebook for our people to be able to watch.
Great, thank you. There's a lot of great material out there right now created by medieval historians about the Black Death, for the obvious reason that we were all scrambling to have something meaningful to say about it in April. And so I've found some other really great resources online that I'd be happy to share. So I'm interested in how we know what we know. I'm interested in what people thought was happening to them at the time.
Right.
And one of the things I've learned is that among the medical professionals, people at the universities of Paris and of, I think it's Marseille or Montpellier, I can't remember, the big medical establishments of Europe at the time, the humor thing wasn't quite answering all of their questions. So they were raising other questions about causation. And so that's something I'd be happy to say more about. And then, what do we know about causes and transmission? There's been some work, there was a lot of debate in the first decade of this century about whether the plague, the Black Death, had really been the bubonic plague. Yersinia pestis is, I think, its name, or something very close to that. Yersinia pestis.
Rachel is very pleased that you knew that, Ellen.
You got it, Ellen. Gold star.
And that around 2010, there were some studies published based on, and I think Leslie Williams has already spoken to you probably about some of these things, but based on DNA material from plague burials in Italy, Germany, London, and they were able to say, yeah, this is the bubonic plague as we know it. This is our friend Y. pestis, and they could sequence the DNA and say that it's been remarkably the same. So there's been more consensus and among medieval historians of medicine about what we're dealing with, and also renewed interest in this question of how did it get from Central Asia to Europe and to the East. And then finally, the thing that interests me a lot as a historian are what kinds of impacts did this have on society? We've now revised upwards our estimates of the population that died in 1347 to 1350 to being probably more than half the population of Europe. I used to always say it was a third. Now that would have been much higher in cities. We think in Florence, it might have been 70% of the population. Imagine that.
Yeah, it almost completely is unimaginable to us, right? It's something from like The Walking Dead or something, right?
And I hate to say it, but it kind of makes COVID a little less terrifying to me. But the mortality, the death rate was almost 100%, at least in that first wave. Yeah. But that therefore had huge economic impacts. It made it harder to move goods around. It gave some increased bargaining power to those who were producing food because there were fewer of them. And then just emotionally, there's a huge, I can show some pictures later, there's a huge religious reaction where people think this is a punishment from God. What can we do to please God? People go around Europe walking into cities in processions, beating themselves with whips, begging God to take the plague away from them. In the Muslim world, there's a different theory of contagion in that in fact they don't believe in contagion in the Muslim world. Illness comes from God. Just that's how it works. But there were similarly, therefore, religious responses praying for God to relieve this illness. And there's some cool developments in art with some really kind of gory skeletons, views of people in their tombs rotting, but I can come back to that later.
Well, I mean, that's funny, right? Because so for me, those are the images, like those medieval paintings and etchings, like that is when I think about what the worst case scenario of a plague could be, or a pandemic could be, it's that, right? A world where this kind of death has become so common that even the only thing anyone can even draw or paint about is, skeletons walking around going, we're dead, right? Which is creepy in its own right. Yeah, right on, Ellen. So as we move then from the medieval period then to later to the 18th century, Kate, I mean, you presented the students with these two pieces that, and I talked about this a little bit in class on Monday. I love these pieces because they show how the same event can be viewed from two different perspectives. And of course, there have been any number of films that talk about about this phenomenon, right? But of course, this is relevant once again because we have a community, two communities in Philadelphia, right? The white community in Philadelphia that views it in a certain way. And then of course, the Black community that has to respond to these accusations about the way that things went down. So do you want to talk a little bit about that then?
Sure. Yeah, I have so much to say about these readings. I think they're so rich. So just very briefly, they're excerpts from two accounts about this yellow fever outbreak in 1793, one written by a white Philadelphian and the other written partially in response to the first by two Black Philadelphians, right? So this first account by this guy, he sort of goes through a little bit by saying, okay, well, this is what happened, right? First, people are trying to figure out the origins of this disease or this illness. Like, what is it? And so Liesl mentioned, that beyond humors, there's this theory of, she said, something in the air, right? That this is something in the air. So this is a really big thing. They're kind of talking about atmospheric conditions, the environment. And so one of the major things is if something has a bad smell, it might cause disease. So there's rotting coffee on the wharves in the port of Philadelphia. And so they're like, this must be the source of this illness. And then they go through this period of trying to, so reading these in light of COVID is really interesting, right? Because they're trying to figure out what are the origins. Was this imported? Is this foreign? Is this disease foreign or is this native? So they go over all this trying to figure out whether it's foreign or native. And then they're like, okay, well, some people start getting sick, but then people started taking notice and it spreads. And it's suddenly spreading throughout Philadelphia, starting in the areas that are next to the docks. And then there's this mass exodus from the city of all the wealthy white people. They're all leaving, just getting out of the city. And economic consequences follow, right? That these people are, other people are unemployed. There's nothing there. They have no, form of employment right now. And so then it's like, okay, then on August 22nd, so this starts happening in early August, mid-August, they recognize it. A few days later, the mayor says the streets have to be cleaned and purified, repeats this order. Then the governor says, this is happening, we need to understand it. And this group of doctors meet and they say, everyone needs to avoid all unnecessary contact with the infected, and you have to mark where an infected person is so that people know to stay away and clean everything. and then do these other things that would relate in some ways that I can explain later or not to Liesel's humors, right? Where people need to also avoid all fatigue of body and mind, avoid exposure to the air and to the sun, and dress warmly, and don't drink too much alcohol. But they're also trying to purify the air, right? So one of the ways they're purifying the air is by lighting all these fires. So on every street in the city made of wood, they're lighting these huge fires. So the mayor's like, you guys have to stop lighting these fires. So then people are like, well, we hear that gunpowder is good. So then they all start firing their guns. And
eating it, right? I mean, I think some of them take to ingesting gunpowder, right?
Yeah, right. It's like
it's like bleach.
Right? They're all just like
internally,
off, and they're like, gunpowder is the thing, it's gonna cure us. So then they have to say, stop doing that. But all these Philadelphians are freaked out, and they are avoiding any bad smell. So they're walking around, they're soaking like sponges and cloths in camphor and vinegar to kind of so that they don't breathe any bad smells, and they're walking around with them over their faces, and they stop being in contact with one another. They is talking about how they avoid each other on the street, and that there's this extraordinary, right, one of the quotes that I like is this extraordinary public panic and the great law of self-preservation. So this is what this guy is saying in part, right? There's a lot more to it, but this is kind of this synopsis. So then what happens is this doctor, who's a pretty well-respected doctor, says, you know what? I think that Black people are actually immune. They don't suffer from yellow fever. And I think this in part, so he thinks this in part because he's like, well, first of all, there's been instances in the West Indies of people getting yellow fever, and it almost never affects people of color. It's always white people. And second of all, he reads this account by a guy who wrote this, I want to say 1748, so like decades before, who says, it's possible that Black people might be immune to this. I don't really know. So he says, I think this is the case. So what he does is he says, Black people of Philadelphia, you are discriminated against, and this would be a really great way to raise your status in the eyes of white people. Why don't you go and help care for all the sick, because you're immune? So nurse the sick people. So then, right, so we get some of this later explanation from this second account that we have written by these two prominent Black Philadelphians. And they're like, they told us, come forward, assist the distressed, the perishing, the neglected, and you're not gonna get sick. Don't worry. So they're like, so we went out to help all those white people dying of yellow fever. We took away their dead bodies, we nursed the sick, and we did all this to be of service, right? So then they're like, but so many people started falling ill and dying, and we had volunteer work, and we had people doing all this stuff, but to bury the dead, we then hired some people to help us, right? And so they say, but it turned out we're not immune, right? We started getting sick and dying too. And he says, to this day, right, which is a year later, but he says, after this has been happening, right, and this is happening really quickly, people are getting sick and dying so fast. He says, they still think, a lot of white people still think that we don't get sick from yellow fever. He says, when the people of color had the sickness and died, we were imposed upon and they're told, oh, that's not what it is. You're sick from something else. And then when we started getting more reports, they basically suppressed the reports. And he says, thus were our services extorted at the peril of our lives, right? And then you blamed us, because then you're like, oh, you charged us for some of these services. And they're like, so I just want to briefly talk about links to today for like a minute. Basically, these are pretty clear, right? But this public fear about not touching others, being afraid of catching something, needs to constantly clean everything, careful about the air we breathe. But the biggest thing is this piece about race, I think, right? Because Black Philadelphians are affected in higher numbers because they are essential workers, right? They're helping out where others wouldn't. They're in these dangerous jobs with high levels of exposure. And ultimately, the thing about race is that in both cases, in COVID and in yellow fever, it's really important to think about this as a social condition, right? In yellow fever, Black people are assumed to be immune by white people, and they're put in hazardous situations even after this is proved to be invalid. But they thought that they're immune not because of any essential bodily difference, but because of social conditions, right? So the people who hadn't caught it in the West Indies were people who had gotten it as children, who had been exposed at a young age and developed an immunity. And so that's why they weren't getting it in the West Indies. So this is a social condition, not a biological one. Just like today, where we are reading, people of color are more susceptible to COVID, but it's not because of an essential biological difference, right? It's because they're put in situations where they're more exposed, or they have prior health conditions, a lot of which are resulting from racism, that are making them more exposed. So anyway, I have lots more to say, but
right on. So, and this is obviously so much of why I love these pieces, right? Because the parallels are actually slightly, for me, somewhat disturbing, right? But it also shows you in some respects how little certain things have changed. And that's a good segue. Phil, you have a question for our historians here, right?
Yeah, so this is coming from sort of an altered couple questions from some of our students. And Kate, you did a great job of sort of teeing up this question, right? Which is, we can spend a lot of time, we've talked a lot about the way that pandemics in history were sort of misunderstood because of misunderstandings or lack of knowledge about things like germs or transmission or vaccines and things like that. What do you think are sort of some of the similarities that you can draw? So it's much easier to see those differences. What do you see are sort of some of the similarities that maybe we should be learning from history that we aren't learning? And then maybe even a little bit more specific to that, what lessons can we maybe take from sort of a classicist or historian's view about encouraging some of these pro-social public health behaviors?
So Ellen, I saw your hand go up first. So let's go to you, and then Liesl, you look like you're ready too, right? So we'll go in reverse order this time. Go for it, Ellen.
I'll be quick. I just another document that I've seen as I've been studying this in the last few weeks is the will of a woman inventorying her family's possessions so that she can inherit them. And in that, it describes how her father got sick and how her husband got sick. And the historian who was analyzing it said, this is terrible because she lost half her family. And the document I shared with you, the video, talked about somebody who lost 7 of his 13 siblings in 2 months, and his parents. But what the historian brought out of it was, what we're also seeing is that they're seeing each other all the time. They don't fully understand how contagion works, but, and in fact, the bubonic plague is not terribly contagious person to person. It really is the fleas and the rats who bring it, but that in the middle of this great crisis, people are going to each other's homes. People are visiting each other. Now, on the one hand, you think, oh, don't do that. That's not safe. But you also think people are trying to support each other. And I think, in my experience of this summer, wearing masks, being socially distant, I have seen more of some of my friends this summer, whether on Zoom or from 10 feet apart on their back deck, than I normally do in the course of the summer. And it has been really, it's been terrible. But the connections I've made with people, the way we have tried to support each other, I think that as long as we're all very mindful, because we know more about modern medicine, of the precautions we have to take, I think we can very intentionally come together if we choose to.
Well, Ellen, I think that was one of the really interesting things about this video, is that it wasn't about the specifics of how one person got it, and it didn't talk at all about this idea that it's a bacteria that's spread by fleas. That the focus of that video is really what this class is about. I mean, we want our students to know something about the biology of the virus. That's important. And next week it's vaccines, people. Very excited about that. But to see that there is a strong historical record of just this existence within the plague, and this existence within this terrible experience that really does kind of parallel in some ways our experience now, because that video talked about the economics, right? The money that was lost by this particular person. And I think you've got a great point about how it is, we really are reaching out to each other in very different ways and very different manners than we have, but we've still managed to come up with ways to connect with one another.
Yeah.
I think that's a great observation.
Yeah, and you know, it's funny you should mention that as well, Ellen, because I had some folks who I hadn't spoken to in 25 years, and through Zoom, you know, it's all of a sudden it's like, well, let's reach out, let's talk, and then of course at the end we're like, why haven't we done this, right? Again, because this horrific disease, this condition, sort of made us focus on the need to support one another, and of course the desire to have that support ourselves. Thank you for that point. Liesl, let's come over to you. So what are we seeing parallel wise?
Yeah, so, you know, one of the big plagues that we know from a couple of historical sources kind of hit the ancient Greco-Roman world and it became infamous. And I'd be shocked actually if, you know, the people in Philadelphia in 1793 and the people during the bubonic plague in 1347 to 50 didn't mention this, right? Is the plague at the city of Athens in the year 31 to 30 BCE. And what I find interesting about that particular plague, at least how the sources tell it, all social decorum mostly went to shit. Sorry for swearing, but that once people around you start dying, and this is, you know, in 430 BCE, people are used to death, right? Like there's a lot of people, they die pretty often, and that's normal. We are not a society that is used to death, processing it socially, processing it spiritually, economically. We just don't see it, right? And so it is traumatizing for us in a way that it's not traumatizing for all societies in all the same way. I'm not saying that it shouldn't be, but just that's our historical moment.
Right on.
So there's this fear, right, when you're surrounded by death, that you might be next, that your family might be next. And so at least according to some sources, right, a lot of the high standards of democratic Athens just kind of went out the window as soon as this plague hit, because everybody was like, I don't want to die, right? And they were in the middle of a siege, and so they were literally trapped inside their city walls, having to undergo this illness. And so, you know, there's people like, you know, leaving bodies in the streets, like, you know, people just sort of like getting naked in a fountain because they were thirsty and hot, people like dragging their relatives into churches and just like leaving them there to die, doctors who, you know, kind of just like give up and are just like, well, I'm not treating anybody, like, because I'm going to get sick. And I think I said this earlier or last spring, right? I'm heartened to see that hasn't happened for the most part in our society.
Yeah, I mean, you know, seriously, you know, thank you very much, essential workers and healthcare workers, for not doing that.
Yeah. But, right, one of the other things that's interesting about the Athens situation is we don't have any evidence that plague actually spread outside the city. So for all that it was deadly inside the city, because they were under siege, because they were at war with their neighbors, and because in the ancient world, you know, they have these things called city-states. And if you think about, you know, prior to air travel and car travel and even bicycling, right? Like the only, as far as you can get in a day is how far you can walk in a day if you don't own a horse, right? And that might get me to Beloit from Madison, maybe, but probably not, right? Like that's what, 50 miles? I can't walk 50 miles in a day, or like, that'd be tough.
You can.
You're a quitter is
if
what
I
you
tried
are.
really hard, yeah. I think I've done like 30 miles in a day. But that was exhausting, right? So the ability for diseases in the ancient world to spread was actually much lower than it is nowadays. And one of the lessons that I think we could be taking from the ancient world is this idea of pocketing ourselves. And we're sort of seeing this with, you know, people who have developed kind of like quarantine pods, right? And I had my brother and his fiance like living with me for a couple of months in the spring, because otherwise they would have been in Brooklyn, New York. And we were our Quarren fam, right? And it was, so this idea that you can create an immunity pocket or a quarantine pocket of other humans, provided that you're not breaking that quarantine amongst yourselves, right, is actually a really effective way of isolating the virus from other populations. And so I think that's a lesson that we could definitely take. The other one is, again, having to do with the idea of research and the development of knowledge, is this idea of thinking outside the box when it comes to diagnosis, treatment, and symptomatology, and having an open mind when it comes to diagnosis, treatment, and symptomatology is something that had to happen in the ancient world because they didn't know any better. Whereas nowadays, it's a lot harder to force ourselves to have an open mind. And when we talk about, like, you know, some of the treatments for ancient diseases, right? Some of it does seem really wacky, like, you know, grinding up cow dung and mixing it with some wine and aging it in a copper bowl or something like that. And then you put that on your eye and it'll stop a bacterial infection. They did find actually that there was a medieval recipe for an eye bacteria that did require like ox gall and an allium and had to be aged in a bronze pot or something like that, and it does work. So they're
Wow.
thinking of using it
I
against
remember
MRSA.
reading about that. Yeah.
Yeah,
A
it's
few years
wacky,
ago.
right?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that we have a bunch of things to learn from the ancient world in terms of disease treatment, but if a treatment worked, right, like they had this kind of trial and error, we'll just throw stuff at it, right? Like, and if it works, don't question why it works, right? Just keep doing it. And if, so long as it's not causing harm, like, treat everybody with it. And so that's something that, I don't know, that would be, that we haven't, like, we're trying to find like, what is the silver bullet, and not necessarily what are some like chunks of silver bullets that are going to work for different people in different areas.
I mean, Liesl, this is really applicable to myself. But so I have hypertension. I was diagnosed in my early 30s, and you know, it was sort of how could I say this? I mean, it was very clear that we were using a shotgun approach, right?
Yes.
Couldn't figure out why, you know, this young man has hypertension, of course, and I have essential hypertension like many African Americans do, right? And so, yeah, I mean, we could ask why this particular thing works and why this doesn't, but as long as it keeps me from not having my head explode, yay! So
Actually, something that might surprise people, how many you know, treatments we have that we don't necessarily know the mechanisms, but we know that they work.
And we know they work.
There's a mythology that science, you know, maybe not serious scientists, but that certainly like scientific media perpetuates, that scientists know how everything works, and that's why they're using the things that they're using. And I think that's, again, it's kind of, coronavirus has really blown up that myth. And I think it's really frustrated and traumatized a lot of people who thought that they could rely on scientists for like 100% accurate information and fast information.
Right. So that, I mean, that brings us to you, Kate. I mean, what kind of parallels do you see here?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, well, I wanted to repeat Liesl's thing about containment works, right? I mean, for yellow fever, what you see when you have different outbreaks in the 18th century, in the 19th century, as people escape cities, you see it traveling up train lines. Yes. You see it going out into suburbs. You see, and when people aren't doing that, containment works, right? The disease doesn't spread. So that's something that we know, but we don't always follow. But the piece about race, right? You know, Ron, you had this comment earlier about how you see these really different perspectives about different people's experiences of an illness. And probably the first account I shared, right, which is this white guy's, becomes the dominant narrative. This is what happened. People got ill. Then this is, and he's talking about white people here, right? He's saying they got sick and then they left and then they had to be tended to. And occasionally you'll see like, oh, you know, there was just one Black person to care for this person. moving on. And so this becomes the dominant narrative that that this terrible disease ravaged the white population of Philadelphia. And you still see things about how, well, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I encounter things about how Black people are less susceptible to yellow fever. And the thing that I think about with that, and then when I think about with COVID, is when you have these statements, you have to think about why, and to not revert to biological race. Oh, bodies are fundamentally different, right? We have to think about the social conditions behind this. Why is this happening? Why are people more susceptible to COVID? What kinds of vulnerable positions are people being put in? What kinds of life experiences are they having that are causing other underlying conditions? That the social piece is so important here.
Yeah, and it's social environmental as well, right? And so yellow fever, right, is associated with the tropical zone in the globe, right? And so it's associated with this particular hot weather. And part of the reason why Black people were assumed to be immune was because they were like from there, and so their bodies were sort of adapted to this hot weather. And it's been interesting to me to watch coronavirus information. Really, like, there was this hope, right, that like come summertime, the ambient humidity was gonna like cause all of our air particles to like magically drop, and then it wouldn't be as communicable. And like everybody's paranoid about what happens in the wintertime when we all start going indoors. And so there is this like weird environmental, like temperature, humidity focus.
There is, but it's also, right, like you see this all the time, right? Like you said, oh, well, Black people are from tropical zones, and so they're more used to it. But then I'm reading something today in a totally different context that they're like, well, all of the slave ships from Africa bring the yellow fever to the Caribbean. So it's like, well, if the slave ships are bringing the yellow fever, and the enslaved people are the ones who are infected with yellow fever, and the enslaved people are themselves Black, then they are not immune, clearly. So it's like this bizarre, convoluted logic that is essentially a form of environmental racism, right? It's a form of sort of saying Black people are in these more dangerous environments, they'll be fine. Or
hey, look, no one ever said racism made sense.
Yeah. True.
Sorry, I digress. Please continue.
No, I was just gonna say, I think that it's really like we have to maintain in COVID and understanding of COVID the social conditions behind the race piece. That I want us to make sure to do that. And I think people are sort of saying essential workers, but they're not. But as long as we're doing that going forward. But I know Ellen and Liesl are both sort of.
I just remembered something. Ellen, go for it though.
I was just going to say quickly that the people who were scapegoated in the Middle Ages for the Black Death were the Jews, and that goes entirely to their social and religious status within the communities. And just as something I hadn't thought about before is they're often accused of poisoning the wells. And that right there goes with this developing sense of disease as a poison.
Yes.
It maybe affects you differently depending on what your humors are, depending on how old you are.
Yes.
But it's that idea that, disease, they're starting to understand contagion and disease coming from somewhere else. And once you start thinking that it comes from somewhere else, well, then you start looking for who's bringing it.
Right.
Yeah.
And it can't possibly be that someone's traditions or beliefs themselves have the sort of protective quality, because then that would imply that there's something wrong with you, right? And that and especially if you've crafted this idea of one group being superior to the other, it makes it very difficult to accept the possibility that someone you've marked as inferior actually is able to, in a superior way, survive this nightmare. Liesl, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to ask if y'all had talked about pulse oximeters and race at all.
We have not.
Pulse oximeters.
No, go ahead.
There's a fabulous article. Oh my God, holy shit. It like blew up my life like yesterday. Because of course, because like everybody, as soon as the happy hypoxia kind of information about COVID came out, I immediately was like, okay, we need to own a pulse oximeter, because like chances are we're going to be asymptomatic. But I'm in my 30s, right? Like I'm not high risk, but I'm a lady, right? But I'm married to a dude who just turned 40, so like, he could be high risk, who knows? But I was like, happy hypoxia. You don't even know that you're hypoxic, and you could be hypoxic. We need to own a pulse oximeter, obviously. But apparently, the entire history of this device has majority tested white people, and it relies on pale skin color to give an accurate reading of the oxygen levels in your blood. And lo and behold, holy crapamola, when they use it on people with dark skin, it's very inaccurate and overestimates the amount of oxygen in people's blood. So it's not, I guess, to add to the social and environmental conditions of race, right? Like, it's not just that people of color are more likely to be essential workers, or more likely to be working outside the home, or more likely to be living in cramped housing, which I think, you know, can also kind of perpetuate a racism of sorts, right? That of like, you know, oh, all these people of color, right? They're just crammed together in these tiny apartments and they're all working. There is also the, you know, once the person starts to feel sick, once they go to the hospital, they're a person of color who feels sick and goes to the hospital. And if the measurements are not accurate, and if there's racism in the hospital itself that takes people's pain and their exhaustion less seriously, then of course people of color are not going to get proper or the same treatment that white people are going to get for exactly the same symptoms and exactly the same disease course.
And this is how you end up with these outcomes that are different without even the intention sometimes of doing this to someone. Funny enough, I was talking to someone today about cameras and how I had this whole deal with my wife, who's white, right? You know, we'll do the Snapchat thing and she'll do the, stick out her tongue and all the little puppy ears and all that stuff come up. And then it comes to me and it's just like, you know, no puppy ears for you, dude. Like, what? What? I want the puppy ears. But you know, cameras were not calibrated for people like me, right? And so you can end up with a device, in fact, right, causing a device that was established and created in a way that did not take people like me into account, right? Helping to exacerbate this problem. So Phil, I mean, we're fast closing in on the end of the hour.
Oh wow!
Phil,
yeah.
Give us something.
Give you something. Okay. Well, I had something else that I was going to talk about, but in fact, I think I'm going to jump instead to maybe a more sort of reflective question that a few of our students had, which is, given everything we've just talked about for the last almost hour, is some of the sort of, to what extent do you think some of the lack of social distancing, the lack of sort of follow through on a lot of the sort of best practices being put out there is a failure to teach history at a broader level? A number of students said, well, is this just that we're not doing a good enough job of requiring students to learn about history, of getting, you know, high school students, college students into these classes? In some sense, it's a chance to plug history and glam, but also just to what extent is this also just a failing of our educational system to properly understand or help students and people understand for generations the impact of disease on society more broadly?
Ellen, you want to, or Kate? I've talked a lot. Y'all should.
So let's Kate in here.
Yeah, so let's take to Kate. Yeah, let's go to Kate and then to Ellen.
Well, I mean, sure, as a historian, I'm going to say absolutely, right? Because you read these things and you're like, whoa, all of this happened before. And it happened before that, and it happened before that, and it happened before that. And so these things keep happening. And so, I mean, I think about this in terms of politics too. Whenever I start to get discouraged, I'm like, oh, I could just look at the 19th century. Right, like all of this stuff is, I don't want to say cyclical, but it's happened before. And I feel like we approach these things, our memories are so short term that we approach these things as, oh my gosh, this is brand new. This has never happened before. This is this new crisis. We're going to have to figure out all these new ways of dealing with it, when we've got a lot behind us that we know is useful information. And I think part of that goes to the significant difference between the way that we approach science and the way that we approach history, right? Because history is kind of like that happened. If you want to know about what happened in the past, you can take history. Otherwise, it's not really that important. And historians also build on other historians a lot, whereas science, you know, like if you think about our library, they're like, well, we're not going to throw away a history book because if it's 20 years old, it's still really current. But science, if it's more than 2 years old, nobody cares anymore. It's always about what's new and what's next. But if you look at kind of the history of science, you do see these things happening, right? Where just one brief example, for a long time, people thought that the environment and the atmosphere really mattered, and you got sick because of bad air, right? We've talked about this. Then along comes the germ theory, and the kind of whole environmental humoral concept goes out the window, because it's like, it's not about, you know, whether you're near water or air or your black bile or your phlegm. It's about, you know, these little germs. And so these are how diseases get transmitted. And it's only been, and then we come around to recent times where it's like, you know what, actually the air you breathe does matter. And it's not just for COVID, it's for like, if you grow up within a few miles of a highway, you are more likely to be asthmatic, or if you, so we do think about, oh, the environment you live in, you know, if you live near pollutants, it can affect your health in all kinds of ways. And so we're kind of now almost back to an environmental model, as we still have the germ theory, but we've ignored it for so long because that's history, right? It's not new research. And so I think that if we taught this more in schools, you know, before students got to college, or even in college more, but it's about that these are actually more connected than we think. You know, a lot of the history I teach is not just like, oh, well, that happened and it's over and it has no consequences and there's no reason to ever think about it again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ellen, yeah, break it down. Ellen, give us something here.
I don't think I can add to that. That's given me a lot to think about. I'm just going to say that my medieval European Civ course is in the second mod, and I've got a whole week-long unit on this. And I'm finding all kinds of fabulous materials that, again, as I said, it's a really rich field, rich area in medieval studies right now. And another thing that is starting to come up is talking about the Black Death in the context of environmental studies, climate change in the Middle Ages, how famine would have into people's natural immunities. So I think there's a lot to learn from the past as we think about how we operate as a society again now.
Awesome.
And I would definitely second what Kate said, that science has, it wants to forget what came before, or thinks that it's on a strictly forward trajectory, or that there is a forward trajectory and not a sort of lateral trajectory. Dr. Anthony Fauci was a classics major when he was an undergraduate. I take some pride in, like, you know, to the extent that he can think outside the box, that he is thinking about the social context in addition to the scientific context. I like to think that some of that came from his study of the ancient world. I will say, you know, a lot of high school seniors this year, it was a period of mourning, right? Like, there was no prom, there was no special graduation ceremony. This has not been the traditional summer before college. And it's really hard to step outside of our lives and see ourselves from the outside and say, yeah, this fucking blows, but it's a year, it's a summer. And there's going to be a lot more summers. There's going to be a lot more years. Like, yes, this sucks, but it's sucking for everybody. And like 20 years from now, it's not going to be that big of a deal. And I think the study of history helps us see the short periods of time for short periods of time, and not get stuck in the now and think that the now is forever, and that the now is this, you know, climactic horror. And not that with regard to the fact that the past repeats itself, right? No historian would say we shouldn't try and stop that from happening.
Right,
but it can be comforting, right, to know that we're not the first humans to deal with this, and we're not going to be the last humans to deal with this, and we might as well arm ourselves with some tools.
And I think that that's you've made a really good argument for people who are involved in healthcare to really pay attention, right? And so you mentioned Anthony Fauci being a classics major, and as a health professions advisor, I tell you that the liberal arts majors who are doing really well in medical professions because of their ability to think more holistically. They're sought after for that reason. So if you're interested in health professions, come to Beloit College. We'd love to have you.
We need you. Come on.
Come to us. We will welcome you with open arms and 6 feet of distance and masks. So, and with that, thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. Just very interesting. I think it's really important for us to keep track of this cyclical nature and this hopefulness that this can potentially give us, that we've been faced with these things and under different circumstances. We've moved through them. We can now, maybe be a little bit more efficient about moving through them, but it's important for us to keep track of this and to think about, what are they going to be saying about us 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, when they look back on COVID. So we like to end with a reminder that we are all human, and that we do things beyond just, talk about COVID. So let's start with you, Kate. What are you excited for this week?
This week, I'm excited. Well, okay, this is so dorky. I don't even know if I should say it. So okay.
Embrace it.
Do it.
Okay. Well, I've been working on my book for a long time, and I'm really excited about editing the chapter that I'm going to edit, which is so dorky, but it's been a while, and I'm excited to get back to my own scholarship. So this is pretty dorky.
That is excellent. That is the perfect amount of dorkiness. Ellen, how about you? What are you looking forward to this week?
There's a guy who's been doing some great weeding in my garden, and it's looking really good.
That's beautiful.
Is that guy Pablo?
I thought I would contrast as much as possible with Kate.
Okay.
That's excellent. Liesl, how about you?
I'm going to take you all on a field trip real quick.
Okay.
The thing that I'm excited about is actually in another room in my house. One of my summer projects has been to rescue and start growing monarch butterfly caterpillars. And so I don't know how well you can see them.
Oh, how delightful.
I've got little chrysalises that are waiting to hatch.
Impressive.
I hatched a girl monarch. I mean, obviously she hatched herself, a lady monarch butterfly this morning. Yeah, that's been my summer project, in addition to my normal writing and stressing out.
I have milkweed in the garden. I found it.
Yay! Good. Milkweed's important.
Phil, your turn.
What I'm looking forward to, I'm gonna take a cue from Ellen's suggestion and say that I'm looking forward to a socially distant outdoor happy hour with a friend on Friday. So Melanie and Rosie and I are going to go sit outside and see some friends. And Rosie, our toddler, has a very nice camp chair / high chair thing that folds up but has a strap. So she can't just wander over to people. As long as she's got some food or something, she's usually happy to chill. So
that's some magic there. Awesome. Ron, how about you?
Season 2, Umbrella Academy, baby. It's happening.
Yes, it's so good.
Happening.
It's so good. Trust me, you're gonna love it.
Thank you. I can't wait.
That is excellent. And Ron, I just finished the second book in the Expanse books, so I'm starting on the next one.
Are you like a speed reader or something? I'm on page 6 or something. Like, great.
I know. I have a lot of insomnia, so I wake up in the middle of the night and try and read myself back to sleep. So
that's a good call.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Ellen, Kate, and Liesl. We really, really, really appreciate your time.
Rachel, you didn't say what you're looking forward to.
Huh?
You didn't say what you're looking forward to.
What are you looking forward to?
No, I'm looking forward to the third book in the Expanse book. That's what I'm looking forward to. And it's my wedding anniversary today, and we're having sushi.
Woo-hoo!
Congrats.
3 years, people. 3 years.
Damn.
I know, right? Wow.
Pat myself on the back. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next week for the last installment in our class version. Well, this season of Let's Talk Coronavirus, we'll be talking about vaccines. We'll be talking about clinical trials. I'm excited to talk about Russia.
Yeah.
It's going to be wild, folks. All right.
Stay tuned.
Bye-bye.
Take care, y'all.
Bye.